6. Stranded on Calypso's island. For 9 days, Odysseus was on his own in the ocean, drifting without food or fresh water. On the 10th day, he was washed up like a piece of flotsam on the shore of a lonely island. He had landed on Ogygia, the home of the goddess Calypso. She found him lying weak and exhausted on the beach, and she treated him kindly. Taking him into her house, she fed and nursed him back to health. It might have been the end of all of his troubles, except for one thing. Calypso fell in love with him. Her love was relentless. She prepared great feasts for him, gave him sumptuous robes, and arranged spectacular entertainments to amuse him. Every day she offered to give him anything his heart desired, except for the one thing he really wanted. She wouldn't let him leave her island. Odysseus was wretched. He pined for his home, for his wife and son, and for his own rocky island of Ithaca. He wasn't interested in any of Calypso's gifts. Day after day, he went down to the seashore and looked out over the ocean, longing to sail away. But what can a mortal man do against a goddess? All he could do was dream of going home, day after day, year after year after year. In Ithaca, too, the years were passing by. Telemachus grew older and taller until he was almost as strong as his father. Penelope was proud of him, but soon he would be a man, and then what would happen to her? Other people were watching Telemachus. When he was 17, men began visiting the palace as suitors, urging Penelope to choose a new husband. She did not want to marry any of them, but they were guests, and she had a duty to entertain them. They exploited her hospitality. Day after day they feasted and drank at her expense, flirting with her maids and insulting her menservants. More and more suitors came, until there were more than 100 of them. They took over her house. Telemachus is grown up, they kept saying, and it's obvious that Odysseus will never return. You must marry one of us. Desperately, Penelope found another excuse. I can't marry yet, she said. Odysseus's father is an old man, and he'll die soon. But I haven't woven a shroud fit to wrap his body in. I can't marry anyone until I've done that. Grudgingly, the suitors accepted her excuse, but they made her promise solemnly that once the shroud was finished, she would choose a new husband. So Penelope began to weave, watching the sea as she sat at her loom and straining her eyes for a glimpse of Odysseus's ship. She was determined not to finish the shroud before he came home. So she wove all day, but night after night, when the suitors had gone home, she crept out of bed and went back to her loom. Carefully, she unpicked everything she had woven that day. But how long could she keep that up before they discovered her trick? Where was Odysseus? The gods were watching him. Looking down from the heights of Mount Olympus, they saw him on Calypso's island. His misery touched the heart of Athene, the goddess with the flashing eyes. Zeus, Father Zeus, she said, Odysseus has always worshipped you. Why are you so unkind to him? I haven't caused his troubles, Zeus replied. They come from Poseidon, the earth-shaker. He is taking revenge for the blinding of his son, the Cyclops. Odysseus has suffered enough, Athene said passionately. He has, said Zeus. And now Poseidon is busy on the other side of the world. Let us decide how to send Odysseus home. Athene already had a plan. Send Hermes to see Calypso, she said. Order her to let Odysseus go, and to help him on his way. Very well, said Zeus, and he called Hermes over to give him the message. Riding the waves like a seagull hunting fish, Hermes traveled over the blue waters of the sea to Calypso's island. He found Calypso at home in her cave, weaving with a golden shuttle. She recognized Hermes at once, but she wasn't expecting the message he brought. When she heard Zeus's orders, she shuddered. You gods are so hard-hearted, she said bitterly. You cannot bear a goddess to choose a mortal husband. I saved Odysseus from shipwreck and took him into my home. I've even offered to make him immortal. How can I send him away now?" "Those are Zeus's orders," Hermes said. "Do you want to rouse his anger?" Calypso knew she had to obey. Sadly, she went down to the seashore to find Odysseus. He was there as usual, sitting on the rocks and weeping as he looked toward Ithaca. When she saw him, her heart was touched with pity. "You need not cry any more," she said. "I'll help you travel home. I can give you materials to make a raft and warm clothes and food for your journey." She fetched a great axe of bronze and an adze of polished metal. Then she led Odysseus to the other end of the island, where the trees grew tallest. He set to work at once, felling trees and splitting them into planks. It took him 4 days to build the raft. He gave it a mast and fitted it with a rudder for steering. When it was ready, he dragged it down to the sea on rollers, and Calypso gave him wine, water, a leather sack of grain, and a store of roasted meat. "Keep the constellation of Orion on your left," she said, "if you want to get back to Ithaca." Odysseus thanked her for all she had done for him, and then launched his raft with a happy heart. Hoisting the sail, he set off in the direction Calypso had shown him, determined to reach home this time. For 17 days and nights he traveled without sleeping, steering by the sun and the stars. At dawn on the 18th day, he saw a shadowy mountains in the horizon. Joyfully, he recognized the outline of the Phaeacian coast. He was almost home, but he was still on the sea, and as Odysseus stared at the mountains, Poseidon noticed his tiny raft bobbing along in the vast ocean. When he saw Odysseus on his way to Ithaca, he flew into a rage. "Miserable wretch," he bellowed. "Do you think you've escaped my anger? See what happens to those who offend Poseidon." Stirring the sea into a fury with his trident, he called up huge black clouds to cover the sky. All the winds of heaven clashed together, unleashing their strength, and the ocean gathered itself into a towering wall of water. Odysseus looked up in terror at the monstrous wave rolling toward his raft. How could he survive such an onslaught? "Why wasn't I killed at Troy?" he shouted in despair. "That would have been a hero's death. The Greeks would have given me an honorable funeral and remembered my story forever. Now I'm doomed to die alone in this terrible storm." Before he'd finished speaking, the great wave came crashing down onto his fragile raft. It spun out of control as the fierce winds snapped its mast in two, and Odysseus was thrown overboard into the dark, salt sea. Down and down he went, dragged under by the weight of the water soaking into his clothes. Desperately, he struggled out of them. Then he swam upward as hard as he could, with his lungs bursting. When he reached the surface, he found the wild storm still raging. Great waves crashed into him, and savage winds battered his face. It was impossible to stay alive for more than a few minutes in such a sea. But his raft was still afloat, tossing on the waves. Its sail and rudder had gone, and it was beginning to break up. But it was his only hope. Fighting his way toward it, he clambered on board, clinging to the splintered planks. The sea flung him backward and forward, thundering into him from every side. He had no way of defending himself from the force of the water. Closing his eyes, he waited for it to overwhelm him. But someone was watching him. From under the water, a pair of eyes was following every movement of the raft. It was Ino, of the slender ankles, a goddess who lived in the salt depths of the sea. She was once a mortal woman, and she knew what it was to suffer. Taking pity on Odysseus, she rose out of the water and settled on his raft like a seagull. "Poor man," she said, "Poseidon is your enemy. He is trying to kill you. Leave your raft behind and swim as fast as you can to the Phaeacian shore. You will be safe there. I'll drown, Odysseus said. Ino shook her head. Not if I help you. Take my veil and wind it around your waist. It will protect you from injury and death, but you must not keep it after you reach the shore. The moment your hands touch dry land, you must untie it and throw it into the sea. Turn your eyes away as you throw it, and it will come back to me. Pressing the veil into his hands, she sank back under the raging sea. Odysseus looked at it suspiciously. Could he trust Ino? Or was she another deceiver, like Circe, tempting him to leave his raft? Wasn't it more sensible to stay on board? Before he could decide, Poseidon whipped up another giant wave. It raced toward him, heavy and menacing, and smashing down onto the raft, knocking it to pieces. Odysseus just managed to catch hold of one plank, straddling it to keep himself afloat. He had nothing now, no possessions, no clothes, not even a raft. His only hope was Ino's veil. Tying it around his waist, he threw himself headfirst into the sea. Poseidon snorted scornfully and abandoned him to the waves. He had stripped him of everything, and he was satisfied at last. For 2 days and nights Odysseus was alone in the wild water. The sea was so rough that he couldn't see beyond the nearest wave. Over and over again, he thought he was going to die. He didn't die. Ino's veil kept him afloat, and the sea drove him steadily toward the Phaeacian coast. On the 3rd day, the wind dropped and he found himself in a calm sea, with the waves that swelled slowly, carrying him toward the shore. It was not a welcoming coast. The sea smashed against the jagged reefs and the sheer cliffs, boiling up in clouds of spray. It threw Odysseus against the rocks, and he would have been seriously injured if he hadn't grabbed one of them to hold himself back. The next moment, the sea retreated, knocking his hands loose and leaving them skinned and bleeding. He forced himself to keep swimming, working his way along the coastline in search of an easier place to land. At last he came to the mouth of a swiftly running stream. Struggling up the stream, he hauled himself onto the bank, out of reach of the waves. He was utterly exhausted, but he had one more thing to do before he could rest. Untying Ino's veil from his waist, he dropped it into the water, turning his eyes away. It was swept off downstream and carried out to sea, back to its gentle owner. After that effort, Odysseus had barely enough strength to find a hiding place. Naked and vulnerable as he was, he crawled up the riverbank into the woods. Curling up under an olive tree, he covered himself with a blanket of fallen leaves and fell fast asleep. Looking down on Ithaca, Athena saw that it was time for Telemachus to go traveling too, now that he was a man. She disguised herself as an old family friend and appeared outside the palace in Ithaca. The whole place was in chaos, with drunken suitors overrunning the hall, while Telemachus sat gloomily in a corner. But he didn't forget his manners. When he saw Athene, he jumped up to welcome her. "What's going on?" Athene said, looking around at the rowdy suitors. "I've never seen anything so disorderly. Odysseus wouldn't have allowed behavior like this." "If only he were here," Telemachus said. "What's happened to him? Why doesn't he come home? Maybe you should go and find out," Athene said softly. "The other Greek kings came back long ago. They might have news of your father, but you would have to sail across the sea to ask them. Are you brave enough for that?" "Yes, I am," Telemachus said fiercely. "I'm as brave as my father, but my mother has forbidden me to go." "Then don't tell her," said Athene bluntly. "Just take a ship and sail away. She'll forgive you if you come back with news of Odysseus." Telemachus knew she was right. Quietly, with her help, she began to make preparations to sail. When the ship was ready, with all the crew on board, he told just one person what he was doing, his old nurse, Euryclea. "I am going to Sparta to see King Menelaus," he said. "You must swear not to tell my mother until my ship is safely out at sea." Euryclea shrieked and cried, but she promised to keep the secret. Before she nursed Telemachus, she had been Odysseus's nurse, and she longed for news of him. Telemachus set sail after sunset, slipping away from Ithaca in the dark. When Penelope heard what he'd done, she was distraught. "Now I've lost my son as well as my husband," she said. She shut herself up in her room and cried inconsolably. But the suitors were delighted to hear what Telemachus was doing. "This is our chance," they said to one another. "He'll have to sail back past the island of Asteris. Let's send a ship there and ambush him. We'll kill him so that Penelope has to marry one of us. And if Telemachus is dead, the man she marries will have the kingdom too." Greedily, they began to plot the murder.